Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. I'm very pleased to be hosting this session this afternoon on behalf of the center, and actually co-hosted with the OECD, which is giving us an opportunity to be part of a fairly elaborate rollout of what I consider a very important report. So we are the Washington event for the release of the OECD's flagship report on multilateral development finance, just released this week. We're fortunate to have a presentation of the report itself from Olivier Catania from the OECD, where he directs strategy and policy as part of the OECD's development program. We're going to hear from Olivier on the findings and sort of characterizations of the report when it comes to the role of multilateral development finance and finance institutions, and what that looks like, particularly in the current context. And with some sympathy to people who work on these major research products, this work was happening in earnest well before the crisis hit, I'm sure. But that gives us an opportunity today, actually, to both reflect on what is really good data and analysis in the report, and then bring it into the current context. How does multilateral development finance look in the context of this global pandemic? How effectively are the multilateral institutions responding? What more should they be doing? What should their donors be doing? And those are all things that this report actually helps us to answer. It gives us the critical raw data that we need to really understand the dynamics around these questions, and then provides a really good analytical framework, I think, for understanding how these institutions operate in relation to each other, certainly in relation to their donors, and how their governance works. Following Olivier's presentation, we have a small but mighty panel in the form of Richard Montgomery and Amanda Glassman, both of whom I'm not going to give their full bios, but just to reassure that they both have deep experience and expertise to help us answer questions around the multilateral system. Richard, currently from his position as the UK representative on the World Bank Board of Directors, again at a time in an institution that really is on the front lines of so much of the crisis response. So I'm eager to hear Richard's perspective on his current institution and also the multilateral system in general. And then my colleague Amanda Glassman, who is Executive Vice President. Did I get that right, Amanda? Yes, among many titles. She wears many hats, but is in a key leadership position for the center. And again, more importantly, I would say brings a really deep research base and policy experience around the roles and behavior and policies of multilateral institutions. So Olivier, we're going to give you 10 minutes to give us an overview of the report. We'll then turn to Richard and Amanda for some opening comments. We will then use in the balance of the hour, which I think promises to be a quick hour, we will have a more informal conversation during which you, the audience, are welcome to submit questions through the YouTube channel. You can do it, I think, with information provided on the screen. You can do it through Twitter at CGDDev and hashtag CGDTalks. So we'll be looking for your questions as they come in. So with that, in the way of introduction, Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you to inform us on the report.
Thanks a lot, Scott, and let me allow to share my screen and send the presentation. The slideshow. Here we go. So thanks a lot again for the invitation and the opportunity, to present this report in Washington that is about multilateral development finance and the COVID-19 era and beyond. And to start, the main message, of the report is that multilateral development finance is on the rise, and the COVID-19 only, increases, this trend, and stresses the importance of the multilateral system, to respond to global crisis. So we see on this first slide, how the multilateral system is growing in importance as a channel of development cooperation. On the left-hand side, you can see that multilateral finance is growing faster than bilateral finance. And on the right-hand side, you see that the main benefactor of this growth are the two main components, the World Bank Group and the UN system. Then when you look at why is this growth and what drives it, you look on the left-hand side, you see that what we call earmarked funding, which means that is funding that the donors decide how targeted it should be, dedicated to a specific country, to a specific topic, and so on. And we see that this is really what drives the growth of the multilateral system. And this is to the detriment of bilateral aid, which means that donor countries do more through the multilateral system and less through their bilateral agencies. On the right-hand side, you also see that there are more and more donors, to the multilateral system. I'm working for the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, but you see that now the non-DAC members represent 1/3 of the core contributors to the system, up to 1/4 of total funding. And what is interesting, if you look at number 6 in terms of the contributors, you will find the private sector with philanthropies that are of increasing importance. Another reason why people and donors like to use the multilateral system is because they find it is more effective. And through our global partnership for effective development cooperation, and we develop some effectiveness indexes, and we see that the multilateral system performed better for all the indexes except one, that is annual predictability. And annual predictability is also linked to the predictability of funding, and again, pointing at the donors themselves. On the right-hand side, you see that the donors, go through the multilateral system for specific comparative advantages. You see, for instance, they will go to the World Bank Group or MDBs if they want to have scale, or if they want to have country ownership because of the local presence, or they will go to the UN in fragile context, and so on. Then that's the good news, but the bad news, is also that the multilateral system is under serious stress. And I think the COVID-19 crisis has increased this stress because of the imperative, to deliver on their mandate. And so they are under very close scrutiny, as we have seen, for many organizations recently. So in the short term, we see that our analysis of the flows to developing countries show a drop for 2020 of $700 billion. And this is mainly due, to FDI and private investment. But again, that's a big gap to fill in. And all the resources are under stress because developed as well as developing countries are hit by the crisis. In the medium term, also, there is more stress because not only you have to make up for the 100 million plus people who are back into poverty, 300 million people, losing their job, and we want to do it better. That's what this famous Build Back Better sentence that everybody is after. So the stress we look under through the light of 3 trends. The first one is that the multilateral system is increasingly crowded and fragmented. On the right-hand side, what we have looked at is the evolution of the multilateral system since its inception after the World War II. And we see 4 waves. The first wave was the creation of the UN, the Bretton Woods institution right after the war. The second wave was during the 60s, 70s, with the change in the geopolitical order and the need to have regional presence and some specialized agencies. The third wave was to fix the failures of the previous waves, and with the creation of lots of vertical funds or again more specialized agencies. The last wave, that is in the 2010s, is with, again, a change in the geopolitical order with the creation in East Asia of the AIIB or the NDB. We don't know what the COVID crisis will do with this trend. Will it accelerate it? And I will come back on it. There are already new creations, new proposals for creation of vertical fund to respond to the crisis. Or will it be, a Darwinian process where there will be a consolidation of the system and only those that will be able to adapt will survive? That's an open question. The second trend that is to be watched is that we observe that the system is moving to an a la carte system. So basically, what we see is that the share of core funding, so that goes to the general budget of the institution versus targeted projects or topics, is decreasing. So we go from a deep multilateral system that is consensus-based to an a la carte system that is more coalition-based. And we'll see in the next slides that this has important consequences for the system. The first one, and we have tried to map here all the multilateral organizations according to their funding vulnerability, looking at how they are dependent on earmark funding and how they are dependent on one or more donors. And we see on the top right quadrant, for instance, the WHO, and that was in the news, during the crisis. And the consequence, if the US was to withdraw from the WHO, will be that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will be the prime funder of the organization. So it will be a private entity that will be the principal contributor to the budget of an international organization. And you see that here at risk also, the World Food Programme just got the Nobel Prize, but it's also in this quadrant. The third trend that I wanted to evoke is that this steady increase in the funding through multilaterals hides disparities and a shift towards less concessionality of outflows. So what I mean by concessionality, it's basically a better deal, a better rate, that you get on the loans. On the left-hand side, you see, again, as we have seen on the inflows here, on the outflows, the World Bank Group and the MDBs are the main organizations spending the money. And on the right-hand side, you see while the concessional funding has remained flat over the years, the non-concessional has increased. And again, it's linked to the fact that the MDBs are the one benefiting from the growth. This has consequences. The first one is that the main benefactors are the middle-income countries and even the upper middle-income countries who are capable of contracting loans at less concessional rates, and also as the targets of the MDBs, for big infrastructure projects, for instance. That means that the downside is that the LDCs and the low-income countries see their share of the outflows drop. This is in part due to the fact that there are less and less LDCs and low-income countries, but still it's something worth looking at. The second consequence of this shift is also in terms, and we used here our own algorithm, that is posted on the SDG Financing Lab to look at the distribution of spending across the SDGs. And no surprise, in light of the two previous slides, we see that SDGs 7, 8, 9, and 11, which correspond to the big infrastructure projects, are the ones that benefit the most. And when you look down, and many people link the COVID crisis to the biodiversity loss, for instance, and you look at life below water or life on land, and you see that these are the least funded of all the SDGs. So to conclude, the question is the COVID-19 crisis a good time, for multilateral innovation? We don't have the data yet, because there is a one-year gap, obviously, to have the data in our system. We know, however, because they were published, that the multilateral development banks, the multilateral system has deployed $250 billion compared to $5.5 billion for the bilaterals. So again, we see that the response to the crisis has been massively through the multilateral system. I mean, so we ran a survey with our members and asked them, did you think that the multilateral system did well? And so they respond positively on all accounts, again, except for two that are related to social protection. And again, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but for instance, France has put forward the idea of creating, I mean, a social protection vertical fund, I mean, as a response to the crisis. Then our members also responded, however, that they saw some limitations in the system. And what I find very interesting is that when you look on the left, the starkest limitation, you see that these are the lack of financial resources and the lack of coordination among member countries, which means that our members, the donors, pointed at their own faults rather than the faults of the system, which I think is also very interesting. So the report, but I don't have time, but invite you to read it and makes a number of recommendations for reform areas and around transparency, systemic coherence, coordination, financial capacity, selectivity, and capacity of adaptation. But again, I won't go into detail, but I thank you very much for your attention and for the opportunity to present those findings.
That's great, Olivier. Thank you very much. That was just there's so much to explore here. I mean, you've given us a great overview, and there's a lot in those numbers. So let's not waste time. Let me turn to you, Richard. I do want to say one thing, though, in bringing Richard in, which is particularly for the World Bank. These institutions sort of we have crude impressions of them. So we look at the World Bank. It's always been an American president. This is sort of the U.S. institution. It's really important to understand the role of different countries, and I say that by way of introduction for Richard, because the UK as an actor in the World Bank is just critically important, not only as one of the largest shareholders, the US is the largest, but really, in the context of this report, when we think of the role of donors and donor contributions to these institutions, the UK is the largest donor to IDA. Equally important to that, even more so, is that with UK money, I think more than any other country in my observation, they think very carefully about what they want from these institutions. And so I tend to view the UK as the noisiest shareholder at the World Bank, and I mean that in the best possible way. I think that's why I was excited to have Richard on the panel, but more generally, I think it's important to recognize these kinds of dynamics and dig deeper beyond the sense of, well, who's the president of the bank, which country is the largest shareholder. So with that, Richard, give us some reactions to the report, or help us take stock of where we are today with the crisis and the multilaterals.
Thanks very much, Scott. And yeah, no, picking up on your comments about the UK funding, we're also responsible for some of the fragmentation, which is why we totally agree now with the Trust Fund Reform Initiative, which is going on at the World Bank, which Olivier mentions in his report. But yeah, I mean, I'm delighted to be on the panel, and thank you very much to Olivier and the team who put this report together. I found it a really interesting report, and thank you to the authors. I should just start with a caveat, though, that I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I'm not actually representing the World Bank, and I'm not representing my government today. I'm commenting on this report from a sort of personal, professional capacity. But just a few comments on the report before tabling a few other issues to fuel debate. I thought the arguments about comparative advantages, both generally and in relation to specific issues like fragile states, were really well made in this report. And I think it paints a very useful picture of the degree of aid fragmentation and an undoubted growing tendency of donors to promote ad hoc initiatives funded by coalitions around themes. And the risks of a more a la carte multilateralism, I think the report does well to lay these out. I also think that the recommendations around sort of the three buckets of reforms and the 6 building blocks that you put up, Olivier, right at the end, I welcome the case that you're making, and also the strapline in part of the report where you talk about building back better after this massive global shock also means improving the way the multilateral aid architecture works. And I don't doubt that all the recommendations you're making are necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. And there are two broad themes that I just wanted to sort of reflect upon when I read the report. And the first is about the wider financing context into which the case for multilateralism fits, and particularly debt, private finance, and bilateral aid. And I'll come on to that in a moment. The second is about the incentives for multilateralism in the present geopolitical context, and given the different scenarios we may be facing in the quite near future. So if I may, I just give you a few reflections on the first issue, this wider financial landscape. And I think you, Olivia, mentioned all of these factors, debt, bilateral aid and private finance. You mentioned them in some way across the report. But I do think these will be really important for defining both the role of the multilateral system and how you make a case for it. And first on debt, the emerging debt crisis, this will be a real barrier to the lending parts of the multilateral system, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks. Debt becomes unsustainable and deeper debt relief is not negotiated, then there is a real risk of more countries tipping into crisis. We're reading about Zambia, and that is clearly quite close to reaching that tipping point. And of course, the MDBs in the multilateral system can respond. The World Bank has a new fragile state strategy, which gives more tools, more remit to work in, whether it's Sudan, Yemen, DRC. But intuitively, I think you might predict that the burden will shift more to sort of the grant-financed UN arms of the multilateral system, especially given rising humanitarian needs. And so the way in which the multilateral system will be put under pressure and evolve may actually be defined more by debt than this report brings out. The second is the prospects for private finance and investment. And I see that you've recommended, Olivier, that more technical work is needed on this. I think there's a phrase somewhere that talks about assessing financial leverage and mobilization abilities of the multilateral system. And I think there's been some good basic analysis done inside the World Bank that things have really shifted. 10 years ago, only used to be about 80% of the financial flows to developing countries. That has shifted to a 50-50 ratio, public-private finance, if I understand it right. And we're all asking a question as to what extent and how can private finance be a key driver of the COVID recovery, and will this shape what we should ask of the multilateral system in terms of helping or hindering that private sector role? And of course, the third is the bilateral aid. And again, I know that you say, Olivier, in your report that you're doing some more work on this. But you do cite a couple of figures that said multilaterals have made 250 billion available for the COVID response, but the bilateral response has only been about 5.5 billion. And I think you're comparing apples and pears in that bit of the report. And as one of the slides you put up today noted, there are some, the bilateral aid system is still really, really important. So I realize we're coming on this topic soon. But I think the case for multilateral finance needs to be shaped by better analysis, perhaps returning to wider aid effectiveness and the donor darlings and orphans of past years. And finally, the second area of debate is about the geopolitics, which of course will shape the incentives for multilateral reform and replenishment. And therefore, whether the case made in the report will gain traction, or we might require different tactics. And this is some criticism of the report, which has to be diplomatic and briefly reference some of these tensions in the overview as well as other trends. And you cite examples to do with the World Health Organization, which I'm sure Amanda will talk about, and the WTO. But I think that there are other tensions which the report doesn't touch on, which have been undermining multilateral enthusiasm, and that's consensus around some of the, particularly amongst major donors and shareholders, on issues such as climate or good governance or even human rights. And rebuilding the consensus on these issues will probably depend on some changes in leadership, obviously. But I think we need to think carefully about the role of how the G7, G20 could play a stronger role in building more consensus around these issues. And there's clearly very divergent scenarios. And in a negative scenario, I suspect we need to be realistic that the focus might shift more to a la carte multilateralism. And then the question comes, how do we harness that more productively? There could be more of a focus on regional institutions and a need to focus more on country level cooperation, even if it's on a case-by-case basis. But obviously there's a potential positive scenario, and my argument is that we need to focus on building particular points of consensus that can energize the system, including climate, debt relief, and what sort of compact or deal the multilateral system will provide in return for more funding. I look forward to hearing further from others and contributions to the debate, but I'll end there for now. Back to you, Scott.
Great, thank you, Richard. That's, I think we'll come back to many, if not most of those issues in our conversation. So Amanda, over to you. You've both thought a lot about and written quite a lot about many of these topics, both within the context of the global health agenda, but even more broadly, I would say. So proceed however you wish in terms of what you want to prioritize in your comments.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks also, Olivier and colleagues, for a very nice report and very beautiful graphics that succinctly conveyed your points. So that's always rare and much appreciated. So I wanted to address two issues through the lens of global health that the report raises. First is the scale of the financing available through the multilateral system. Whether it is proportional to the requirements and the size of this and future shocks. We knew when we started, the UN had generated an enormous estimate of the SDG gap of $2.5 trillion. When we look at the 2018 figures, we're looking at it, I guess, with respect to that overall financing ask. And then if we look at what's happening with COVID-19 in general, we can say fairly directly that the amount of the response is insufficient as it is happening so far, both in the aggregate terms as well as when we look at specific instruments. But I would say the other thing is that every day we're seeing a new ask come out with a different number and a different estimate of the financing gaps, and everyone is going to the same donors again, as your very nice table that shows the concentration of donors in some of these multilateral organizations. It's really just the same 14 high-income countries that finance most of these organizations, and with the exception of maybe AIB and NDB. And so what exactly are we trying to accomplish here with this very elaborate and complex architecture? So just to refer to some of Scott's work that I'm sure he can bring up later, if we have 104 billion coming in from the World Bank, how does that compare to the size of the shock? Scott and Justin, my colleagues, have pointed out that high-income country stimulus was about 8% of GDP, whereas low-income countries are still at 1% or less. We have the issue of net flows. We have the issue of the modalities that are being used to get the money out to countries, that it's still wrapped up in infrastructure operations and other kinds of modalities that are not quick funding to be able to scale up social protection, as you were showing in your very good graph, or even the restoration of essential services of healthcare. I would say I haven't even seen an estimate of what would be required to revert the deterioration in the coverage of essential health services, and how we're doing really in terms of the coverage and scale up of some of the COVID-19 interventions in low and middle income countries. I think there's another and there's another issue there, and that is that the banks, both the World Bank Group as well as the regional development banks, are the ones that are able to move most volume of resources. They are able to reprogram. They were the first to provide country support. I think that's what we see when we see your donor survey response. And yet many of the countries that are shareholders in the system have been making strange choices in terms of how to mobilize the amount of resources required. So if we looked at, how the IDA replenishment fared last year, knowing that IDA is one of our most powerful tools in the response to this shock, the US actually gave much more money to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria than IDA in its last replenishment. And I think that sort of goes to the point of sort of like, how is the system really supposed to work together to deal with these shocks or these common goods in health, and is the way that we're organized helping or hurting, and how much are the member countries sort of looking across their investments to set out a more coherent vision of how it should all work together. I'll just say another word about financing gaps. I mean, that the access to COVID-19 tools accelerator that has been formed by a number of the health multilaterals, Act A, they said 38 billion in needs for vaccines and diagnostics. I mean, presumably this is part of the exit strategy. So far, only 2.6 billion have been raised to date. If we look specifically at COVAX, only for low-income countries, they're trying for 2 billion, of which 700 million were raised as of September. There was a new World Bank announcement about a commitment to vaccine spend, but it was unclear how much would go through COVAX and how much not, and really what needed to happen with COVAX in order to make it work better. But in general, when you look across Act A, as they call it, yet another acronym, which is like a multilateral initiative multilaterals, what you see is that the community has kind of split up different products and different initiatives amongst themselves because they cannot, no one is sort of in charge here saying, WHO, you're best at this, and World Bank, you're best at this, and we will invest accordingly. A great example is even just like procurement of tests and PPE. Everyone wants their, UNICEF does it, UNOPS does it, WHO does it, World Bank does it. Okay, well, some multiplicity of purchasers is fine, but given that low and middle income countries as a group are now competing against the high income countries to buy these products, it's just not clear whether fragmenting it, even within the multilateral system, makes much sense from an efficiency perspective. So that to say, I mean, the whole product, we're talking about an entire financing package in response to COVID that is needed and desirable to cope with the health and economic consequences. But there seems to be a huge amount of sort of apparent overlap, fuzziness, and uncertainty that we've created with the system as it works today. As you said, it's not really a system. But another question is like, are we going to set up a COVID-19 agency after this? We set up UNAIDS. Do we keep UNAIDS? Do we need a global health security? Is that WHO? Is it Global Fund? I mean, we need some more coherent language on this. And then second, just more briefly, I just wanted to speak about the idea of effectiveness indicators that are developed in the report. And that, we have been talking about for a long time, ever since the Paris Declaration on Effective Aid. And I guess I would still urge us to be very skeptical about what we call, aid. One thing is aid effectiveness, right? Which is the things like country ownership and did they use a country system to measure things? Versus, these are all things that would reduce transaction costs. And in that sense, they are effective. But part of the reason why donors like a la carte and they like investing in these specific use funds is because they are perceived to have more impact on outcomes. That's development effectiveness. And I sometimes feel that when we say as a general category, multilaterals are better than bilaterals because they use a results indicators framework from government data, just doesn't appeal to me as really the effectiveness that we're seeking from the system. And I mean, this is an issue in COVID-19 as well. Are we going to accept as given official data? Are we actually going to massively move to budget support and then use these country systems to track everything? I think what seems clear from the experience so far is that we actually really need a WHO, or we need some organization. I hope we don't start another multilateral, please no. But we need some organization that can develop independent estimates of effectiveness of the things that we care about, whether it's COVID-19 cases, whether it's deaths. These things are now life and death, and we really do need to have a vision of what development effectiveness means that includes an independent assessment of progress. Okay, I'll stop there. I had a lot more to say, but I want to talk with you.
Thank you, Amanda. I have to say all three of you are making my job harder than I want it to be because you're raising so many good issues, and I struggle to figure out how to bring them all back around. But and Olivia, I want to give you the opportunity to react to anything you've heard so far. But let me start by trying to come back to sort of a bigger overarching question. And I think this is a little bit, Amanda teed this up a little bit, but particularly as we're thinking about the moment and the current crisis, and those of us who think that the scale of response isn't enough globally, it's not enough for developing countries. when it comes to the multilateral system, do we mean that as, are we making a judgment about, well, let me say, when we say it's not enough, and particularly for the multilaterals, it does revert back to donors. I mean, the multilaterals rely on their donors to determine what they can do and the capacity to do what they do. So when it comes to those donors and the choices they're making, and Richard, you alluded to this as well, bilateral, multilateral, are we aiming for overall greater ambition? All donors should just be doing more, or is there a share issue here that we would prefer, particularly in the crisis responses, that there's greater reliance on multilateralism than we see currently? And we have to acknowledge, I think, as you all have, that we are relying on these institutions. But I guess the question is, how should we evaluate the bilateral multilateral trade-off in the current moment? There is a budget constraint that everyone faces, so it is a trade-off. So any reactions to that? But maybe Olivia, you can jump in first and respond to any other issues you'd like.
No, thanks a lot, Scott. And then let me start with your question. I think for ministers of development, like for any other minister, is to convince, the Minister of Finance. That's really the difficult thing to do. And for a Minister of Finance to be interested, they would say, what's in it for us, and what will it bring back to our country? And something that we have all, so far failed to do is to show that development cooperation actually was a domestic policy. And we see with the COVID, that we are as strong as the weakest link, in the system. And we see that the price we pay for failed health policies, in third countries, or the price that we pay on climate, same, or with displacement of populations. And I think that's where we need to communicate better and stress the cost of doing nothing versus the cost of acting and investing in prevention mechanism. To put it in simple terms, when you put $10 trillion in a stimulus package, and then you wonder whether you will be able to keep your level of aid. It's like saying, okay, we'll spend everything on reanimation services in hospitals and spend nothing on vaccines. That's a bit what we are doing. And I think the COVID case made that very strong. The private sector has already started to react. And we have seen in the recent months a surge in ESG, reporting and adoption of ESG by the private sector, because we start to see that the value of assets is affected by those risks. And we need to put in place a better management of those long-term risks to preserve the value of assets. And the private sector is already moving, but we feel that the public, is still lagging behind in terms of the standards, regulations, and everything. And linking it to one point that Amanda made in terms of measuring impact. What does it mean? To be a sustainable investment and so on. So I think this is something that is changing, but so far we have failed, and we have to see if we manage to convince our ministers of finance.
Richard, do you want to come in next?
Sure. I think you're touching on some really difficult issues, Scott. And I think burden share is something that is making lots of people very nervous at the moment. You can look at the Olivier's report actually, and you can work out who amongst traditional donors is underweight and who is overweight in different parts of the system. And maybe there should be a bit more honest rather than diplomatic discussion, but it's not my job to have that discussion in a public forum. But there could be a bit more debate in the think tank world about that. But I really struggle with this because, of course, there's also non-traditional donor burden share, which has been rising gradually. I think a bit less than implied in the text of the report, but and of course that fuels some of the tensions and disagreements. I think there's a sort of sense that the report claims that a la carte multilateralism is being driven by traditional donors. It's not just being driven by traditional donors, it's also being driven by non-traditional donors. And I think that the burden share is a very sensitive topic, and I think it would be great to have a bit more independent analysis of that from places like CGD. I have been mulling over this, that the willingness for burden share may shift in either direction, not just because of geopolitics, but the way the COVID crisis evolves. So, and we haven't really talked much about the IMF, which I think is a critical part of the economic safety net. And we are really worried about, there are some countries that you can see some proxy indicators that if there is a wave of corporate debt, then you may have local banking stress in certain countries. And of course, banking stress leads to that debt being put on the public balance sheet at some point, which needs bailing out from other global institutions, including IMF, ultimately. I'm being extremely crude here for want of space. But you know, if the economic crisis gets worse and we see more countries being tipped over off balance, as it were, because of debt and other types of crisis, then I think willingness to talk about burden share might rise. And you know, if we could get ahead of the curve, that would be great. But I think that will depend on some of the geopolitical issues I mentioned earlier. I do think there are some issues. I mean, I was talking at a very general level, and I was really interested to hear Amanda speak. And I think that Amanda, I think you have a fantastic grip on some of the big issues, particularly in the health sector. I do think that the report that Olivia's put forward really does emphasize how important the comparative advantage of the multilateral system is for particularly fragile states, but also underneath that, issues like the growing food insecurity crisis that we're seeing. We are really worried about the data coming out of WFP, and Brookings also is doing some analysis that shows rising food insecurity and the real risk of famines, you know, in about possibly 6 countries in the next few months, but next year and potentially many more. And I think the multilateral system is the only one that can really coordinate a response to that global crisis. And I think on the vaccines, yes, I mean, the bank, I know that there are some things which are still unclear about the bank's 12 billion commitment, of which about 6 billion is IDA and 6 billion is IBRD, and there's a bit of confusion about how it relates to COVAX. I think there is a real willingness on the part of the bank to be working as closely together with COVAX. That means that I think most of that 12 billion should be considered as a contribution to the 36 billion overall target, although I'm not sure that's the way it should be counted. But I also think that the bank is being cautious because there's quite a lot about the delivery mechanisms we don't yet know and can't verify. So, and that relates both to the global COVAX initiative, but also how you're going to deliver vaccines once they're existed and once they are appropriately verified, how you're going to deliver them in different contexts, given the machinery of vaccination will actually be quite different in different contexts. So I think the bank is being wise, the bank has really stepped up on this, from going from 0 to 12 billion in 2 months flat, basically. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. But I also think people have to bear with some of the uncertainties because the real complexities out there in the wider world about how best to deliver this once we know what types of vaccines really are available and what it will take to deliver them. But I think vaccines, food security, fragile states, you know, these are areas where I can see willingness to have a debate about burden share. These might be the wedge issues that we have to have a debate about how we make sure the multilateral system is resourced. And the incentives to do that may increase given what happens in the world, in the wider economy. Back to you, Scott.
Great. Amanda, please come in.
I've forgotten the question because the points were so interesting.
Well, mostly at this point, I would say respond to Richard in particular. I raised very good. Back to some of what you said.
So, I guess the only issue, well, I don't want to dive too far into COVAX as a particular issue, but you know, I think the question is that we're trying to send signals to vaccine manufacturers about the volume of vaccine to purchasing, and obviously 6 billion additional from the World Bank would be transformative to the demand case for COVAX as a purchaser. So, you know, having some clarity about that sooner rather than later as the candidates make their way through phase 3 is probably pretty important. Of course, acknowledging that delivery is also a huge, huge issue. I think maybe another thing, I think the World Health Organization issue in particular is quite interesting. how convincing its different functions are in terms of making a case for a big package of financing, and that other organizations are better at doing advocacy for resourcing. Let's put it that way, right? And I think we even see that, if I compare the fundraising effort around IDA versus the fundraising effort at the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria does an amazing job at making the case and creating moments and making it nice for a finance minister to commit to spend money. And, the question is, are organizations like IDA and the WHO prepared to do that as well? Or is it that the donors would sort of take a more, I guess the point is like there's not really a rational approach to this in some ways. It's that you create the political goodies that enable the willingness to pay in at a higher level. And, could be related to the social protection stuff, or could be related to the vaccines, whatever it might be, but the case has to be made a bit differently. It has to be made in the media, and it has to create an opportunity to finance ministers to get benefits from it, and global leaders to get benefits from it. That seems like the world that we live in right now.
So let me stick with the the report calls a la carte. I mean, I think it covers a lot of different issues actually, but so let me try to pursue two of them I think that are in that vein. And one is actually to pick on Richard a little bit, but let me be careful about this, to be fair. So I joked at the beginning about the UK being a noisy actor in the bank, and in a very good way. But I actually want to pick that up a little bit. So we had a question come in from the audience that asked about, when it comes to this a la carteism, or donors being directive of the institutions, doesn't that also arise in, say, the IDA replenishment process? And here, the UK was called out by name to say, as a large and sometimes largest donor, the UK government, and not unique here, I should add, has very specific objectives in a replenishment, aligned with government priorities, whatever they may set, and that does have the effect, when you are a large donor, of certainly shaping, if not driving, some aspects of the outcomes. So then you have a number of donors playing this game, and you can either, it can drive you toward a clearly defined agenda, or it can drive you toward incoherence as you're trying to satisfy everyone. So I guess partly I would like maybe Richard to make the case for, if you're a big donor, you come with big asks. And by the way, just let's not be coy about the substance. It's not as if we're talking about, I would say virtually any donor to IDA, the nature of the asks are all, versions of what the country thinks is good for development. I mean, we're not talking about things that are, fundamentally questionable. But I think there is, we have to question what that dynamic does to this, and the tendency perhaps toward a la carteism. So that's part of it, is that I'd like you all to maybe say a bit more about those dynamics. So let's call them the large donor dynamics. And then the other one that, I think is really interesting in the report, in one of the very nice graphs, points to private donors. And in a lot of the context we're talking about, when we say private, we really mean philanthropic. And when we say philanthropic, we really mean the Gates Foundation. They are playing that kind of singular role. So I wonder if we can't, and in many respects, we can draw the same characterizations, that this is a donor actor that has very clearly defined objectives, their objective isn't multilateralism per se. It is about achieving certain outcomes around their goals. And I would say the Gates Foundation in particular has become very smart about how to engage in the multilateral system on behalf of their objectives. So how does that fit into this picture? Where, how should we think? And particularly, this is a system that is defined essentially by sovereign actors. That is the nature of the system. And yet, this sort of activity is bubbling up. Is it a problematic challenge to the system? Is it healthy? It's sort of a healthy source of innovation. That, isn't it a nice thing that you have this very well-staffed foundation with a lot of experts who are thinking long and hard about their development agenda and then bringing that to the donor table? So that's, those are some different things. Let me just throw it out there. Who wants to take it first? Rich.
I'm happy to come in, Scott, although you should wave a red card at me if I go on too long, because you're triggering some very big issues. So I think the accusation against a major donor like the UK, and there are a cluster of us, it's not just the UK, at the World Bank, the accusation about a la carte multilateralism is really about the trust funds, of which they have got out of hand. And that's why we support the trust fund, the umbrella trust fund reforms, which are handing a bit more power back to the World Bank and management to organize, gain economies of scale, and reduce the transaction costs of different donors asking for individual reports on everything. I don't think either is a la carte multilateralism. I mean, if I remember correctly, the 5 big themes of IDA 19, which were negotiated amongst, literally dozens of shareholders, were fragile states, gender, jobs and economic transformation, better governance, these sorts of themes. And they set results targets, which are, I think, the bank has an incentive to avoid too onerous and unachievable results. And so there's a lot of haggling that goes on in the IDA replenishment process. But the way IDA gets used is very much a country-led approach. And I think that IDA is actually one of the best illustrations of effective multilateralism, ultimately. The trust funds, perhaps less so, but I do think that trust funds, you have to expect that some themes that are not getting, which are not incentivized for some borrowing countries to take up seriously, they can be incentivized by pump priming those issues through trust funds. So I think the question is about balance, not either or saying that trust funds are a bad thing. I can think of lots of issues that started as trust funds and have become core development themes. I think, and we also need to be aware that some really large trust funds are actually ways of putting grant finance alongside bank finance in fragile states. So the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund is the biggest, I think, that the UK contributes to or has done over the last 5-6 years in terms of grant finance. So they also play a critical role in a lot of fragile states that can't take so much either. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think it would be really nice. I mean, I'm going to say something slightly controversial and don't want to be quoted, which is there is a role for funders to set standards and push the quality of aid and effectiveness. And of course, there's a role for borrowing shareholders at the bank to argue for realism and patience and not to get too unrealistic about reform. And I think that is a healthy tension. But it is the role of different types of shareholders in the bank to pull the institution in different direction. I'm not saying one side should have primacy, but I don't think you'll get more contributions to the multilateral system without a focus on effectiveness and what the money will buy. That's what my ministers are always asking. What does the money buy? And of course, some of that is about tangible results like health systems or girls in school. But some of it has to also be about policy reform and capabilities built, the higher level outcomes that the bank is probably premier in promoting, which is how can economies be better managed? How can you manage resources better? And what sort of policy reforms will crowd in investment to get the economy going? And that's where development policy lending, which the bank is now, along with the EU and 1 or 2 other agencies, is really the only institution which is doing this on a large scale. So I think IDA is a really good buy if you can Other people will disagree, but back to you.
That was a very good answer. I agree with it. It also helped sharpen my question, I think, to the other two. And again, I want to come back to these one version of non-traditional donors, these private donors. But for Amanda and Olivier, so the sharpened version is, even if we accept Richard's argument, which I do, that donors legitimately and constructively bring a voice to the money, or do they ask too much for even the core contributions they make? So set aside earmarks and trust funds. Are they asking for too many things in exchange for their money? And then what do we make of this new set of actors, foundations that they're not making contributions to support multilateralism in the abstract. They have very clear asks for their money. They know what they want. So how do we assess all that?
Well, first, I think, it's an acknowledgement of reality to say that donors get a say in what is financed and how it is financed. For me, the issue is more about a consistency of approach across the multilateral entities. So, for example, if the UK, I'll just take the health sector because I know it well, but you're contributing to Gavi, you're contributing to COVAX, you're contributing to Global Fund, you're contributing to the World Bank. How do you foresee those contributions working together vis-a-vis a client country on the other side of the negotiating table? And is there a way, if we're doing a performance agreement on one side with the Global Fund, is it consistent with what we're trying to accomplish with IDA over here? Now, of course, as a bilateral actor operating through multilateral channels, inevitably there will be incoherence and inconsistencies, and that's just part of life. But I think there are a lot of things, and I agree with you. For me, IDA is the shining example in lots of ways about a very constructive way that donors can sit together with recipients and negotiate a package of basically unearmarked resources for their own priorities, but following certain kinds of best practice modalities in terms of the ways that they'll articulate and measure results. So, I would hope to see more IDA in other settings rather than more of the other settings in IDA. So I think that's sort of the issue I was thinking about with the big donors. In terms of the role of philanthropy, I must say, I wonder, wouldn't it be better, just from a financial and governance standpoint, it would be so much better to have the Gates Foundation sit on IDA together with the other donors. Now, I know that creates a crazy precedent for lots of other reasons, and it puts them at the same level as a nation state. But on the other hand, if they're willing to come in with several $1 billion, isn't it better to have them as part of the governance process rather than building a large trust fund alongside to incentivize certain specific things and to do basically soft earmarks on that concessional pot of resources? I sort of would think it makes sense to bring them in some ways. I understand that it creates all kinds of problems, but I think it's just an acknowledgement of reality. Likewise with the World Health Organization. Again, it's like if an intergovernmental body is no longer reflecting reality in the way that you're financed or in the way that you act, why do we pretend that it is still only about nation states? Of course, we have the issues of how, corporate interests, how to control conflict of interest and things like that. But you can imagine developing rules of the game to make that possible. And I think that's something to look at in the vertical health funds. For IDA, is that they are able to philanthropy sits on those boards. Philanthropy has a say in the rules of the game, and then they are less involved in the details of how the organization does every little thing. So something to think about, I think, in terms of options going forward.
Great, Olivier.
Just to your first question, on a la carte, just to mention that we also look in the report at the behavior of the different donors. And we see that the strategies, can vary a lot across donors. Some spent a lot on one organization, with the objective of influencing the organization, and some others just spent across the whole spectrum of the organization. And for the first time also, we'll publish more granular data on earmarking, because so far people think earmarking is bad, core funding is good. but that's not that easy. And so we will put up, on our website, the donor profiles with regard to earmarking, so that you know exactly how precise the earmarking is for each and every single country, which will help you then assess their strategy. On the private sector, I think it relates also to a remark that Amanda made earlier on how good you are to make your case. And I think for why health was so successful with philanthropy, because it's easier to measure impact. You can tell how many people received vaccinations. You can say I eradicated a certain number of diseases and so on. And for other topics, it's not that easy, and which means that philanthropy will probably not be interested, at least, for those coming and linked to the private sector with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That will be harder to achieve. And just to conclude, my final point to say that the previous epidemic that was AIDS, conducted to huge innovation, in terms of financing development. And I'm curious to see what's down the line with the current one, including looking at global taxes and how this could feed into development finance.
Great. In my mind, it's always a good sign that we have to end when there are still many questions to ask and answer, and that's certainly the case here. I have more questions in my queue, but we are at the end of the hour. I guess I will say as an observation, which would have been a question that I posed to all of you, but I will spare you, which is, I think it will be a question for 2 years from now if we look back and see a multilateral system that was strengthened by the crisis, or we look back and say, what the hell happened to multilateralism? Because frankly, the latter has been more of the mood of the crisis so far, even in the face of data that suggests actually, multilateralism is quite strong. But we are facing that kind of pivotal moment, and I think it is a resilient system, but these crises don't come along all that often at this scale, and it's really hard to predict. So I think it's I'll be eager to have this session again in a few years and see where we are. But I want to thank all of you for making me smarter on this today, and I know our audience is better off for having listened in today. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to see you.